In the summer of 1903, construction workers renovating the abandoned Ravens Hollow Manor in Clarksville, Tennessee, made a discovery that would chill them to the bone. Buried 3 ft beneath the mansion's stone foundation, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a rusted metal box, lay 47 photographs that documented one of the most brutal family murders in post-Civil War America. These weren't crime scene photos taken by investigators. They were something far more disturbing, a photographic confession of revenge so methodical, so calculated that it took 27 years for anyone to understand what really happened to the Holloway family on that blood-soaked night of October 13th, 1876. The photos showed everything, every beating, every humiliation, every act of cruelty that led to 5 machete blows in the dead of night. But most shocking of all, they revealed that the killer had forced the family's patriarch, a man obsessed with documenting his own power through photography, to capture his own family's execution, one agonizing frame at a time. Before we continue with the story of Ravens Hollow Manor and the dark secrets buried beneath its foundation, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because what happened in Tennessee could have happened anywhere in the Post or South, where power, hatred, and revenge created a perfect storm of violence that most people preferred to forget. The question that haunted investigators in 1903 wasn't just who killed the Holloways. It was why someone felt compelled to document every moment of their suffering with the same meticulous care that Cornelius Holloway had once used to photograph the suffering of others. Clarksville, Tennessee, in 1876, was a town caught between two worlds. The old plantation aristocracy still clung to their faded glory, while freed slaves and poor whites struggled to carve out new lives in the ashes of the Confederacy. The Cumberland River wound through tobacco fields that had once made fortunes built on human bondage, and now hosted an uneasy peace where former masters and former slaves worked side by side under vastly different circumstances. At the heart of this tension stood Ravens Hollow Manor, a three-story Georgian mansion that commanded a view of nearly 2,000 acres of prime Tennessee farmland. Built in 1834 by tobacco magnate Jeremiah Holloway, the estate had survived the war largely intact, protected by its owner's shrewd ability to switch loyalties when Union forces occupied the region. By 1876, the property was managed by Jeremiah's son, Cornelius Holloway, a man whose interests extended far beyond tobacco cultivation. Cornelius had developed two consuming passions that would ultimately seal his family's fate. The first was photography, a relatively new art form that fascinated him with its ability to capture and preserve moments in time. His personal darkroom occupied an entire wing of the mansion's basement, equipped with the finest cameras and chemical processing equipment that money could buy. Local society ladies paid handsomely for formal portraits, but Cornelius preferred documenting what he called the reality of Southern life. Candid images of field workers, street scenes, and what he termed anthropological studies of the region's diverse population. His second passion was considerably darker. Cornelius Holloway had developed a reputation among the local workforce, both black and white, as a man who took particular pleasure in asserting his authority through humiliation and physical punishment. Unlike his father, who had been a relatively benign master by the standards of the antebellum period, Cornelius seemed to relish the psychological torture that came with economic control over desperate people. The Holloway family of 1876 consisted of Cornelius, his wife Margaret, a delicate woman from a prominent Nashville family who spent most of her time in laudanum-induced stupors, and their 3 adult children. Edwin, 28, had inherited his father's cruel streak, but lacked the intelligence to temper it with discretion. Caroline, 25, possessed a sharp wit that she used primarily to devise new forms of social torture for those she deemed beneath her station. The youngest, Thomas, 22, had returned from his studies at Vanderbilt University with modern ideas about labor relations that put him at odds with his family's methods. though he lacked the moral courage to openly oppose them. The plantation employed nearly 60 workers, a mix of sharecroppers, day laborers, and domestic staff who lived in a collection of ramshackle cabins scattered across the property. Most were former slaves who had nowhere else to go. Trapped in a cycle of debt and dependence that differed from slavery primarily in its legal technicalities, the Holloways maintained this system through a combination of economic manipulation, social pressure, and, when necessary, outright intimidation. Overseeing this workforce was Ezekiel Hayes, a tall, soft-spoken man in his 40s, who had served as foreman since 1869. Hayes was one of the few employees who could read and write, skills that made him invaluable to Cornelius, but also potentially dangerous. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Hayes had managed to save a small amount of money over the years, and rumors persisted that he was planning to purchase a small farm of his own once he accumulated sufficient capital. What the Holloway family didn't realize was that Ezekiel Hayes possessed another skill that would prove far more significant than his literacy. During his youth, he had worked briefly for a traveling photographer who had taught him the basics of camera operation and print development. It was knowledge that Hayes had kept carefully hidden, understanding instinctively that information was often more valuable than money in the complex social dynamics of Reconstruction-era Tennessee. By the fall of 1876, tensions at Ravens Hollow Manor had reached a breaking point. Poor weather had damaged much of the tobacco crop, reducing profits and making Cornelius increasingly volatile in his treatment of the workforce. Several families had attempted to leave the plantation, only to be told that outstanding debts made their departure impossible. Those who protested too vigorously found themselves subjected to public beatings that Cornelius had begun photographing as what he called deterrent documentation. Images he claimed would serve as warnings to others who might consider challenging his authority. The morning of October 13, 1876 began with an autumn chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of everyone at Ravens Hollow Manor. Cornelius Holloway had spent the previous evening in his darkroom developing what he would later tell his wife were some of my finest work, though he refused to show her the images, claiming they were too sophisticated for feminine sensibilities. The household had fallen into its typical rhythm by sunrise. Margaret Holloway remained in her chambers, nursing what she claimed was a persistent headache, but which the servants recognized as another laudanum episode. Edwin had ridden out before dawn to inspect the furthest tobacco fields where reports of worker sabotage had reached his father's ears. Caroline was entertaining a female friend from Nashville, regaling her with stories of plantation life that carefully omitted the darker aspects of their family's management style. Thomas remained in the library, attempting to work on correspondence related to his father's business affairs, while struggling with increasing doubts about the family's methods. Cornelius himself was in an unusually good mood, humming as he prepared his camera equipment for what he announced would be a productive day of documentation. He had received word that a group of workers had been meeting secretly in one of the abandoned tobacco barns, apparently planning some form of collective action regarding their working conditions. Rather than simply confronting them directly, Cornelius had devised what he considered a more elegant solution. He would photograph their conspiracy and use the images to demonstrate the futility of challenging established authority. What Cornelius didn't know was that his planned ambush had been anticipated. Ezekiel Hayes had developed an extensive network of informants among the household staff, people who had grown tired of watching their friends and families subjected to increasingly cruel treatment. Sarah Hutchkins, who cleaned Cornelius's dark room, had noticed the disturbing nature of his recent photographic work, images that depicted not just punishment, but seemed to celebrate the humiliation of workers who had dared to assert their basic human dignity. More crucially, Hayes had discovered that Cornelius had been selling copies of his more degrading photographs to minded plantation owners throughout the region, turning the suffering of Ravens Hollow's workers into a source of additional income and entertainment for others who shared his sadistic proclivities. The confrontation began at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon when Cornelius arrived at the suspected meeting location, armed with his camera and accompanied by two of his most trusted enforcers, men he paid to maintain order through intimidation and violence when necessary. What he found instead of cowering workers was Ezekiel Hayes and a dozen others waiting calmly in the center of the barn, with an expression of resigned determination that should have warned him of the danger he was walking into. "Mr. Holloway," Hayes said in his characteristic quiet voice, "I believe it's time we had a conversation about the nature of respect." Cornelius, still confident in his position of authority, began to raise his camera. "The only conversation we'll be having, Ezekiel, is the one these photographs will have with anyone else foolish enough to think they can organize against me." It was then that Hayes revealed his own camera, a simple but functional device that he had constructed in secret over the previous months, using parts salvaged from Cornelius's discarded equipment and techniques learned through careful observation of the plantation owner's methods. "Funny thing about photographs, Mr. Holloway," Hayes continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. "They tell the truth whether we want them to or not, and I've been documenting truths of my own." What happened next would be reconstructed only 27 years later when those buried photographs finally came to light. Hayes had spent nearly 2 years systematically documenting the Holloway family's treatment of their workers, creating a visual record of cruelty that was far more comprehensive and damning than Cornelius had ever imagined possible. Every beating, every humiliation, every deliberate act of psychological torture had been captured through hidden cameras and careful timing. But Hayes hadn't simply been building a legal case. He had been preparing for a very different kind of justice. The photographs found in 1903 revealed that what occurred in that tobacco barn was not a spontaneous act of violence, but the opening move in a carefully orchestrated campaign of revenge that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Hayes and his conspirators had managed to overpower Cornelius and his enforcers, but rather than simply killing them, they had chosen to turn the plantation owner's own obsession with documentation against him. The first indication that something was terribly wrong at Ravens Hollow Manor came when Edwin Holloway failed to return from his inspection of the outer fields by sunset. As darkness settled over the plantation, Caroline began to worry, though her concerns were motivated more by social embarrassment than genuine affection. Her Nashville friend had extended her visit specifically to meet the entire family, and Edwin's absence was disrupting carefully planned dinner arrangements. Thomas attempted to organize a search party, but found that most of the usual workers seemed to have mysteriously disappeared. The few household servants who remained moved through the mansion with an odd mixture of nervousness and suppressed excitement, as if they were privy to information that the family members could not access. Margaret Holloway, emerging from her chambers for the first time in 2 days, declared that she had been experiencing disturbing dreams filled with the sound of camera shutters clicking in rhythm with what sounded like chopping wood. Her family dismissed this as another laudanum-induced hallucination, but the servants exchanged meaningful glances that suggested her subconscious mind might have been processing sounds that her conscious awareness had chosen to ignore. As night fell completely, the mansion seemed to grow colder despite the substantial fires burning in every occupied room. Caroline's friend, unnerved by the strange atmosphere, announced that she would be departing first thing in the morning, cutting her visit short with a transparent excuse about family obligations in Nashville. It was nearly 10:00 when they heard the first sound, a distinctive metallic clicking that Caroline initially mistook for a grandfather clock that needed winding. But the rhythm was wrong, irregular, and seemed to be coming from outside the house rather than from any of the timepieces scattered throughout the mansion's rooms. Thomas, the most practical of the remaining family members, suggested that the sound might be related to some piece of farm equipment that had been left running. He volunteered to investigate, but as he reached for the front door handle, the clicking sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow more ominous than the mysterious noise had been. What they didn't realize was that Ezekiel Hayes and his fellow conspirators had been systematically positioning themselves around the mansion for hours, using their intimate knowledge of the property's layout to remain invisible while documenting everything through a network of carefully placed cameras. The clicking sounds had been the coordinated operation of multiple photographic devices, capturing images of the family's growing anxiety from angles that would later reveal how completely surrounded and vulnerable they had been. The photographs recovered in 1903 would show that this was not merely a plan for murder, but an elaborate psychological campaign designed to generate the same kind of helpless terror that the Holloway family had inflicted on others for years. Hayes had studied his targets with the same methodical attention to detail that Cornelius applied to his photography, identifying each family member's particular fears and vulnerabilities. Caroline, for instance, was terrified of social humiliation, the possibility that her carefully cultivated reputation might be damaged by association with scandal or violence. Photographs showed that Hayes had arranged for several of her Nashville acquaintances to receive detailed letters describing the Hall family's treatment of their workers, ensuring that her social standing would be destroyed, even if she somehow survived the night. Thomas's greatest fear was intellectual inadequacy, the possibility that his university education and modern ideas might prove worthless when confronted with real-world challenges. The recovered images revealed that Hayes had planted evidence suggesting that Thomas had been embezzling money from his father's accounts, creating a paper trail that would destroy his reputation and future prospects regardless of the evening's outcome. For Margaret, whose eldom addiction had become an open secret, Hayes had prepared a particularly cruel psychological torture. The photograph showed that he had gained access to her private supply of the drug and gradually replaced it with a harmless but ineffective substitute, ensuring that she would experience withdrawal symptoms that would make her final hours as agonizing as possible. But it was Cornelius himself who was to receive the most elaborate treatment. Hayes had discovered that the plantation owner's greatest source of pride was his photographic skill, his ability to capture and preserve moments of power and dominance. The recovered photographs revealed that Hayes intended to turn this obsession into the instrument of Cornelius's destruction, forcing him to document his own family's death with the same meticulous attention to detail that he had once applied to recording the suffering of others. As midnight approached on October 13th, the remaining members of the Holloway family huddled together in the mansion's main parlor, maintaining the pretense that nothing was seriously wrong, while privately acknowledging that they were facing some kind of coordinated threat. The servants had all vanished hours earlier, leaving the family completely isolated in their own home. It was Caroline who first noticed that someone had been inside the house during their absence. Her jewelry box had been rifled through, not for theft, but apparently for the purpose of photographing its contents. Small items had been moved and rearranged in ways that suggested systematic documentation rather than random searching. Thomas discovered that his father's study had received similar treatment. Papers had been photographed in place, then carefully returned to their original positions. Someone had been building a comprehensive record of the family's private affairs with professional thoroughness. But it was Margaret who made the most disturbing discovery. In her private chambers, she found that her Lord's supply had been supplemented with a collection of photographs showing her in various stages of drug-induced stupor, images that had apparently been taken over a period of months without her knowledge or consent. The sound of deliberate footsteps on the front porch, brought an end to the family's increasingly frantic search of their violated home. These were not the quick, nervous steps of someone seeking help, but the measured pace of individuals who were completely confident in their purpose and timing. Thomas, attempting to maintain some semblance of authority, called out through the locked door, "Who's there? What do you want?" The response came in Ezekiel Hayes's familiar voice, but with an undertone of cold determination that none of the family members had ever heard before. "Mr. Thomas, I believe your family has something that belongs to us. We've come to collect what's owed. Our accounts are settled, Ezekiel." Caroline replied, though her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her growing fear. "Father has always been fair in his business dealings. Miss Caroline, I'm not talking about money." The sound of multiple people moving around the house's perimeter became audible. Footsteps on gravel, the creak of wooden porch boards, and underneath it all that distinctive metallic clicking that had haunted them throughout the evening. It was then that Cornelius's voice could be heard from somewhere outside, though his words were muffled and indistinct. What was clear, however, was the tone, a mixture of rage and terror that suggested he was no longer in control of the situation. Margaret began to weep quietly, her withdrawal symptoms combining with her growing panic to create a state of near hysteria. "They're going to kill us," she whispered repeatedly. "They're going to kill us all." Thomas attempted to rally his family's courage by reminding them of their social position and the legal protections it supposedly afforded. "This is still Tennessee," he declared with more confidence than he actually felt. "There are laws and there are consequences for breaking them." "Yes, Mr. Thomas." Hayes's voice replied from just outside the window, "There are indeed consequences. And after 7 years of watching your family break every law of human decency, it's time to explore what those consequences might look like." The family situation became clearer when Edwin's voice joined the conversation, but he was clearly speaking under duress, his words carefully coached and delivered with the mechanical precision of someone repeating instructions under threat. They want Father to come outside," Edwin announced, his voice cracking with strain. "They say they have photographs to show him evidence of things he's done." Caroline moved to the window and attempted to peer through the curtains, but the darkness outside was too complete to make out anything more than vague shapes moving in the shadows. "Edwin, are you hurt? What do they want from us?" "They want justice." "Caroline, they want Father to see what he's created." Edwin's voice grew stronger, as if speaking the words was providing him with some form of clarity or resolution. "And they want him to document it the same way he documented everything else." It was at this moment that the true nature of Hayes's plan began to reveal itself. This was not going to be a simple murder motivated by revenge. It was going to be an elaborate reversal of power relationships, with Cornelius forced to play the role of documenter, while his family experienced the same helpless terror that had been inflicted on so many others. Thomas made a desperate attempt to negotiate, calling out through the door, "Ezekiel, if there are grievances to be addressed, we can discuss them like civilized men. There's no need for violence or threats." "Mr. Thomas," Hayes replied, "your family stopped treating us like civilized men a long time ago. Tonight, we're simply returning the favor. Now I need Mr. Cornelius to come outside. He has work to do." The photographs discovered 27 years later would reveal that Hayes had spent months planning this psychological torture with the same methodical precision that Cornelius applied to his darkroom work. Every aspect of the evening had been choreographed to maximize the family's terror while forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions in the most direct way possible. But Hayes had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that Cornelius Holloway, faced with the systematic destruction of everything he valued, would break down and submit to whatever humiliation was planned for him. Instead, the plantation owner's response would prove to be far more complex and ultimately more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with Hayes and his conspirators maintaining their positions around the house, while the Holloway family remained barricaded inside. But as time passed, it became clear that the siege was having an unexpected psychological effect on both sides of the conflict. For the family, the prolonged tension was creating fractures in their unity that Hayes had probably not anticipated. Margaret's withdrawal symptoms were becoming more severe, causing her to make increasingly irrational demands for lordom that no one could fulfill. Caroline's fear was manifesting as rage directed not at their captives, but at her father, whom she blamed for creating the situation through his treatment of the workers. Most significantly, Thomas was beginning to verbalize doubts about his family's behavior that he had previously kept to himself. "Father has gone too far," he admitted quietly to his sister. "Some of the things I've seen, the photographs in his study." "We deserve whatever's coming to us." Caroline turned on her brother with fury. "How dare you take their side? These are criminals, Thomas. Murderers and thieves who want to destroy everything our family has built." "What we've built is rotten, Caroline. It's been rotten for years, and Father's made it worse with every passing month." Thomas's voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. "Maybe it's time someone held us accountable." Outside, Hayes was dealing with his own challenges. Several of his co-conspirators were becoming nervous about the extended timeline, worried that their absence from the worker quarters would be noticed by someone with connections to local law enforcement. More problematically, Cornelius had begun attempting to turn the situation to his advantage by engaging Hayes in a dialogue about photography and documentation. "Ezekiel," Cornelius called out, "if you truly want to document injustice, then you need to understand the technical aspects of creating compelling images. Light, composition, timing, these things matter if you want your photographs to have the impact you're seeking." It was a shrewd, psychological gambit. By positioning himself as an expert whose knowledge was essential to Hayes's success, Cornelius was attempting to transform himself from victim to collaborator, creating a relationship dynamic that might provide opportunities for escape or reversal of the situation. Hayes, however, had anticipated this strategy. The recovered photographs would later reveal that he had been studying not just Cornelius's methods, but his personality, identifying the plantation owner's tendency to believe that his expertise made him indispensable regardless of circumstances. "Mr. Holloway," Hayes replied, "I appreciate your offer of technical assistance. In fact, your expertise is exactly what we need tonight. But first we need to discuss the subject matter of your recent work." "My recent work? The photographs you've been taking of our people, Mr. Holloway, the images you've been selling to your friends in Nashville and Memphis, pictures of human beings being treated like animals, sold as entertainment to people who share your interests." The accusation hit Cornelius like a physical blow. His side business, selling degrading photographs to other plantation owners throughout the region, had been his most carefully guarded secret. Known only to a handful of customers who paid premium prices for images that allowed them to vicariously experience the psychological torture, they were too cautious to inflict directly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Ezekiel." Sir, we found your customer correspondence, names, addresses, payment records, and specific requests for particular types of documentation. It seems you've built quite a profitable business around our suffering." Inside the house, the family was beginning to grasp the full extent of their father's activities. Caroline, who had always prided herself on knowing everything that occurred at Ravens Hollow Manor, realized that she had been completely ignorant of an enterprise that had apparently been operating for months. Thomas felt his stomach turn as he remembered occasions when his father had insisted on photographing punishment sessions, claiming it was necessary for record-keeping purposes. The true motivation had been far more sinister and far more profitable. Margaret, in her drug-adult state, began laughing hysterically. Of course, she gasped between fits of laughter. Of course, he was selling them. Everything in this house gets sold eventually. Why not our souls? The revelation created a shift in the psychological dynamics both inside and outside the mansion. Hayes had succeeded in demonstrating that Cornelius's cruelty extended far beyond simple sadism. It was a calculated business enterprise that turned human degradation into profit. For the family members, this knowledge created a level of moral complicity that made their situation feel less like victimization and more like inevitable consequence. But Hayes was not finished with his revelations. The photographs recovered in 1903 would show that the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Information that would transform the standoff from a confrontation between oppressor and oppressed into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. As dawn began to break on October 14th, Hayes finally revealed the true scope of his documentation project. From various hiding places around the mansion's grounds, his Confederates retrieved camera equipment and began setting up what could only be described as a photography studio, complete with reflective surfaces to control lighting and carefully positioned props that would soon serve their intended purpose. "Mr. Holloway," Hayes called out, "it's time for you to see the full extent of your legacy." What emerged from the darkness was a collection of photographic evidence so comprehensive and damning that even Cornelius seemed stunned by its scope. Hayes and his team had been documenting not just the treatment of workers, but the entire economic system that the Holloway family had constructed to maintain their power and wealth. Images showed the deliberate contamination of worker housing with materials that caused sickness, ensuring a steady supply of desperate labor. Photographs documented the systematic cheating of sharecroppers through falsified weight measurements and inflated supply costs. Most damaging of all were images proving that the family had been selling defective tobacco to Union Army suppliers during the war, while simultaneously providing quality products to Confederate forces. A level of treachery that could still result in federal prosecution even 11 years after the conflict's end. "How did you get these photographs?" Cornelius demanded, his voice now showing the first signs of genuine fear. "The same way you got yours, Mr. Holloway. Patience, planning, and access to the right equipment." Hayes's response carried a note of grim satisfaction. "The difference is that my photographs document crimes while yours celebrate them." Thomas, watching from the window, felt the last of his family loyalty drain away as he recognized scenes from his own participation in various forms of fraud and exploitation. Caroline saw herself in images that revealed her role in the social isolation and psychological torture of workers' families. Even Margaret was represented in photographs that showed her providing false testimony to law enforcement officers investigating worker complaints. "What do you want from us?" Caroline finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Justice, Miss Caroline, but not the kind you're expecting." Hayes's response was followed by a sound that chilled everyone who heard it. The systematic clicking of multiple cameras being prepared for simultaneous operation. "Mr. Holloway, you're going to help us create a new kind of documentation. Images that show what happens when the natural order reasserts itself. When people who have been treated like animals remember that they're actually human beings with the capacity for choice." Cornelius understood the implications immediately. "You want me to photograph my own family's execution. I want you to create a masterpiece, Mr. Holloway, the culminating work of your artistic career. Images that will ensure this night is remembered long after all of us are dead." The recovered photographs would later reveal that what happened next was not a simple murder, but an elaborate artistic collaboration between Hayes and Cornelius that neither man could have anticipated. Faced with the certainty of death and the opportunity to create something that would outlast his physical existence, Cornelius made a choice that surprised everyone present. He agreed to participate. "If we're going to do this," Cornelius declared, his voice regaining some of its old authority, "we're going to do it properly. Real artistry requires more than just pointing a camera and hoping for the best." What followed was a bizarre collaboration between victim and executioner, with Cornelius providing technical expertise while Hayes supplied the creative vision. Together they constructed a series of photographic tableaux that documented not just the family's death, but their acceptance of the justice of that death. The first subject was Margaret, whose years of willful blindness to her family's cruelty had been enabled by her laudanum addiction. Cornelius directed the positioning of light reflectors, while Hayes arranged the scene with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. Margaret was seated in her favorite parlor chair, surrounded by dozens of empty laudanum bottles that Hayes had collected over months of careful observation. But the most chilling detail visible in the recovered photographs was her expression, not of terror or pleading, but of profound relief, as if she was finally being freed from a burden she had carried for years. "The lighting needs to capture the texture of her skin," Cornelius instructed, his voice carrying the same professional authority he had used when photographing society portraits. "The way the drug has aged her, it tells the story of complicity through self-destruction." Hayes nodded, adjusting the camera angle to emphasize the contrast between Margaret's faded beauty and the squalor of her addiction. When the moment came, she closed her eyes and whispered what sounded like a prayer of gratitude before Hayes's blade ended her suffering with a single precise motion. Caroline's execution required more elaborate staging, reflecting her role as the family's social coordinator and her particular talent for psychological cruelty. The photographs showed her surrounded by mirrors, dozens of them, arranged to create an infinity of reflections that had been her obsession in life. Letters from her Nashville friends, now knowing the truth about the Hollow family's treatment of their workers, were scattered around her feet like fallen leaves. "She needs to see herself," Hayes explained as he positioned the final mirror to understand how others have seen her all these years. Cornelius worked with the focus and exposure settings, ensuring that every reflection would be sharp and clear. "The repetition will create a sense of endless judgment," he agreed. "Each mirror shows her from a different perspective, but the vanity remains constant." When Caroline finally understood what the mirrors were meant to represent, the eyes of every person she had humiliated, every worker's family she had destroyed through social manipulation, her composure cracked completely. The photographs captured not just her death, but the moment of self-recognition that preceded it, the instant when she saw herself as others had always seen her. Thomas required a different approach entirely. His execution was staged in his father's study, surrounded by the financial documents that revealed his complicity in years of systematic fraud. But Hayes had added a cruel theatrical element. He had positioned Thomas at the desk where he had worked on those fraudulent calculations with pen in hand, as if he were signing his own death warrant. "He always wanted to be the intellectual of the family," Hayes observed as Cornelius adjusted the lighting to create dramatic shadows across the documents. "Let him use that intelligence to understand exactly what he's done." The recovered photographs showed that Thomas was forced to read aloud from each document before his death, publicly acknowledging every act of fraud and embezzlement he had participated in over the years. His final words, recorded by Hayes in careful script across the bottom of one photograph, were, "I knew it was wrong, but I was too weak to stop." But it was Edwin's death that provided the most psychologically complex images in the entire collection. Hayes had constructed an elaborate recreation of the punishment sessions that Edwin had supervised, complete with the same ropes, chains, and instruments of torture that had been used on workers over the years. The photographs showed Edwin experiencing each form of abuse in sequence, while Cornelius documented every moment with the clinical detachment of a medical researcher. "This is not revenge," Hayes explained as he prepared each instrument with methodical care. "This is education. He needs to understand what he put others through." Edwin's screams, according to witness accounts recorded years later, could be heard throughout the plantation grounds. But what disturbed observers most was not the sounds of his suffering, but the moments of silence between them, when Cornelius would call for repositioning of lights and cameras to ensure optimal documentation of each stage of the torture. The most haunting image in the entire collection showed Edwin in his final moments, no longer screaming or pleading, but looking directly into the camera with an expression of what could only be described as understanding. He had finally grasped the full weight of what he had done to others, and his face reflected not just physical agony, but the deeper pain of complete moral comprehension. Each execution was captured from multiple angles with professional lighting and composition, creating images that were simultaneously horrifying and undeniably artistic. Cornelius, working with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his previous work, ensured that every photograph would serve as both evidence and artwork. The strangest aspect of the entire process, according to the detailed notes found with the photographs, was how completely Cornelius had embraced his role as document of his own family's destruction. He offered technical suggestions, adjusted lighting, and even critiqued composition with the same passion he had once applied to his commercial portrait work. "Art demands truth," he declared as he prepared the camera for the final series of images. And truth, it seems, demands sacrifice. The final images in the collection showed Cornelius himself, photographed by Hayes using the plantation owner's own equipment and techniques. But these were not images of defeat or victimization. They showed a man who had achieved a kind of twisted artistic fulfillment, someone who had created his masterpiece, even as it documented his own destruction. The photographs buried beneath Ravens Hollow Manor in 1076 remained hidden for 27 years, during which time the official story of the Holloway family massacre became part of local folklore. According to the version accepted by law enforcement and repeated in newspaper accounts, a group of disgruntled workers had murdered the family during a robbery gone wrong, then fled to parts unknown with whatever valuables they could carry. This explanation satisfied everyone who had an interest in avoiding deeper questions about labor relations and social justice in Postrian, Tennessee. The local sheriff, who had received regular payments from Cornelius Holloway to ignore worker complaints, had no desire to investigate circumstances that might reveal the extent of his own corruption. Neighboring plantation owners, many of whom had been customers for Cornelius's degrading photographs, were equally motivated to accept a simple narrative that didn't implicate them in broader patterns of systematic abuse. Ezekiel Hayes and his co-conspirators were never officially identified as suspects, largely because no serious attempt was made to investigate the crime beyond its most obvious aspects. Hayes himself disappeared from the region within days of the massacre, along with several other workers whose absence was attributed to understandable fear rather than complicity. The mansion stood empty for years after the murders, acquiring a reputation for being haunted that effectively prevented any serious attempt at renovation or resale. Local children dared each other to approach the building on Halloween nights, while adults crossed themselves and hurried past when business required them to travel the road that ran alongside the property. It wasn't until 1903, when changing economic conditions made the land valuable for railroad development, that serious efforts began to prepare the site for new construction. The discovery of the buried photographs created a sensation that extended far beyond Clarksville, with newspapers as distant as New York and Chicago running sensational accounts of the Tennessee terror pictures. But the most disturbing aspect of the discovery wasn't the evidence of the Holloway family's crimes, or even the graphic documentation of their executions. It was the realization that Hayes had created something that transcended simple revenge. He had produced a work of art that forced viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, power, and the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. Modern viewers of the photographs, according to contemporary accounts, found themselves unable to look away despite the horrific subject matter. The technical quality of the images, combined with their emotional and moral complexity, created a viewing experience that was simultaneously repulsive and compelling. Several of the photographs were displayed in a Nashville museum for a brief period in 1904, where they attracted crowds of visitors who waited in line for hours to view what newspapers had dubbed the most disturbing images ever created in American photography. The exhibition was closed after less than a month when religious and civic leaders complained that the images were corrupting public morals, but not before they had been viewed by an estimated 10,000 people. The photographs themselves eventually disappeared from public view, though copies were rumored to exist in private collections throughout the region. Occasional claims surfaced over the decades that someone had discovered additional images or documentation related to the case, but none of these reports were ever substantiated with physical evidence. Ravens Hollow Manor was eventually demolished in 1905, with the railroad company that purchased the property reportedly burning all the remaining structural materials, rather than risk having them used in other construction projects. Workers involved in the demolition later claimed that they had found additional hidden chambers and secret passages throughout the building, suggesting that the Holloway family's secrets might have extended even beyond what Hayes had managed to document. The site of the mansion is now occupied by a railroad switching station and freight depot, with no visible markers indicating the location's dark history. But local folklore maintains that train engineers still report unusual sounds and sights when passing through the area late at night. Clicking noises that seem to echo from the ground itself, and fleeting images of figures moving with cameras among the shadows cast by the industrial lighting. Perhaps most significantly, the case established a precedent for using photography as a tool of social justice that influenced investigative techniques for decades to come. Law enforcement agencies began to recognize the power of systematic documentation in building cases against powerful individuals who had previously been protected by their social status. Social reformers adopted similar methods to expose conditions in factories, tenements, and other institutions where abuse flourished in darkness. The question that haunted everyone who encountered the Ravens Hollow photographs was whether Hayes had achieved justice or simply perpetrated a more sophisticated form of cruelty. By forcing Cornelius Holloway to document his own family's destruction with the same meticulous care he had once applied to documenting the suffering of others, had Hayes created a form of poetic justice? Or had he simply proven that he was capable of matching his oppressor's capacity for calculated cruelty? The answer, like the photographs themselves, seems to exist in a moral gray area that defies simple categorization. What cannot be disputed is that Hayes succeeded in creating images that continued to disturb and challenge viewers long after the immediate circumstances that produced them had been forgotten. Today, more than a century after that terrible night in October 1876, the story of Ravens Hollow Manor serves as a reminder that the relationship between documentation and power remains as complex and morally ambiguous as ever. In an age when everyone carries a camera and the ability to create and distribute images has been democratized beyond anything Hayes or Cornelius Holloway could have imagined, their collaboration stands as both warning and inspiration. A demonstration of photography's power to reveal truth, create art, and serve justice even when that justice comes at a price that civilized society finds difficult to accept. The workers who discovered those buried photographs in 1900, 3 later, reported that they had been unable to sleep for weeks after viewing the images, haunted not just by their graphic content, but by the unsettling realization that they had witnessed something that was simultaneously horrific and beautiful, a masterpiece born from the darkest impulses of human nature. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire story is not what the photographs revealed about the past, but what they suggested about the future. Hayes had demonstrated that systematic documentation could be used not just to record history, but to create it, to transform victims into executioners and executioners into artists, blurring the lines between justice and revenge in ways that continue to challenge our understanding of both concepts. Just when we thought we'd seen the full horror of what happened at Ravens Hollow Manor, new details continue to emerge that make the story even more disturbing. If this tale of buried photographs and documented revenge has given you chills, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our exploration of America's hidden past, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what other secrets might be buried beneath the foundations of our nation's history. The final photograph in Ezekiel Hayes' collection, according to those who saw it before the images disappeared from public view, showed something that no one could have anticipated. It was a self-portrait of Hayes himself taken using a timing mechanism of his own design, showing him standing among the bodies of the Hollow family with Cornelius's camera in his hands. But his expression was not one of triumph or satisfaction. It was a look of profound sadness, the face of a man who had achieved everything he had planned while discovering that victory tasted like ashes in his mouth. Beneath the photograph, written in Hayes's careful script, was a single line that served as both explanation and epitaph for everyone involved in that night's events. Sometimes justice and tragedy are the same thing, separated only by the perspective of the observer. This mystery shows us that the tools of power can be turned against those who wield them, but transformation comes at a cost that extends far beyond the immediate victims. The line between justice and revenge, between documentation and exploitation, between art and atrocity may be thinner than any of us would care to admit. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Hayes achieved justice? Or did he simply become another kind of monster? Could there be other collections of photographs like these buried and waiting to be discovered in forgotten corners of our nation's history? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and often feature the most insightful responses in future videos. If you enjoyed this journey into America's darkest photographic secrets and want more stories that explore the hidden violence beneath our nation's polite historical narratives, subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who understands that the most terrifying stories are often the ones that could actually be true. Until next time, remember that every old house has secrets, every family has darkness, and sometimes the most important truths are the ones that someone tried very hard to bury. See you in the next video where we'll explore another mystery that proves the past is never really dead. It's just waiting for the right person to dig it up.